So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us here in the world of Zoom. I think we are also streaming on Facebook, so however you're joining us, thank you and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Weidlinger, the director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Michigan, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the 30th annual David W. Belin Lecture in American Jewish Affairs. This lecture series was established in 1991 through a generous gift from the late David W. Belin of Des Moines in New York to provide an academic forum for the discussion of contemporary Jewish life in the United States. Mr. Belin, a graduate of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, the Business School, and the Law School at the University of Michigan, had a distinguished career in law and public service. An exemplary public servant, Belin served as counsel to the Warren Commission, which investigated President John F. Kennedy's assassination, and was executive director to the Rockefeller Commission, which investigated CIA activities within the United States. A founding chairman of Reform Judaism's Outreach Commission and founding member of the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, Belin served the American Jewish community in numerous leadership roles. That service reflected his concern for the future of American Jewry and stimulated him to endow this annual lectureship to provide a forum for the discussion of contemporary Jewish life in the United States. In addition to giving a public lecture at the University of Michigan, each year the distinguished Belin speaker provides a written version of their remarks, which the Frankel Center publishes. The existing Belin publications provide a valuable retrospective of the major issues facing the American Jewish community and a sampling of the depth and variety of research and scholarly thinking on American Jewry. Previous scholars to hold this honor include Deborah Lipstadt, Samuel Friedman, Ruth Messenger, Jim Leffler, Beth Wenger, and Lila Corwin Berman, among many others. And all of those lectures are available on the website of the Frankel Center. Tonight's lecturer, Pam Nadell, is Patrick Glendenin Chair of Women's and Gender History and Director of Jewish Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. Her books include Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985, which was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award, and most recently, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, which won a National Jewish Book Award and was published last year. Let me pause for a minute here to state what a monumental task writing a book on the history of American Jewish women is. For it tells the collective story of so many women, many of whom have been ignored by historians for centuries. Religious and secular, born into privilege and self-made, active in the public sphere and confined to the home. She shows how being Jewish in America changed for women over time and how Jewish women changed America. Nadell's narrative weaves the stories of ordinary women in with those who have become household names. As Jordana Horn put it in a review in the New York Times, Nadell produced a, quote, thoughtful history of a group of diverse, passionate, contemplative, vocal, and dynamic women, and is a welcome addition to the American historical canon. It's truly remarkable to read this book and appreciate how these women, numerically small, qualitatively great, made such a tremendous impact on this nation. And we all came to recognize the tremendous impact that American Jewish women have had on this nation on the eve of Rosh Hashanah when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. Personally, I got to know Pam when she was president of the Association for Jewish Studies and I was a vice president. I admired her respect for the Hamish or cozy traditions of the organization and at the same time her vision for a more inclusive future of the field. Her commitment to maintaining the scholarly rigor of Judaic studies, and her enthusiasm for expanding our reach to a broader public. Her recognition both that the organization represents a multitude of diverse political opinion, and her advocacy for the common causes. All these leadership attributes stand out in her writing as well. She's recently written on anti-Semitism in America for the Washington Post, and testified before the House Judiciary Committee on the topic of anti-Semitism on college campuses. Her talk today, which represents new research, is entitled, It Can Happen Here, Anti-Semitism, Gender, and the American Past. I'll turn things over in just a second to Professor Nadell, but I want to say after the talk, we'll have some time for questions and answers. Some of you have submitted questions in advance. If you would like to pose a question during the talk, please write it in the Q&A segment on Zoom, which you can see down at the bottom where it says Q&A, and you should be able to click that and pose a question. And then at the end, I will moderate the questions and give Professor Nadell the opportunity to answer them following the talk. So I will now turn things over to Pam Nadell.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey, so much for that very generous, very warm introduction. I am so honored to give the David W. Belin Lecture on American Jewish Affairs. Every year when I get the printed copy of the lecture, it goes at the very top of my pile to read. It always becomes the next thing that I read because these have been such thoughtful contributions to our understanding of the American Jewish experience. So I'm going to start. I'm going to share my screen and do that right now. Let's see, and I hope that you can all see it. And I want to begin with something that's a little bit unusual for a faculty member. I'm actually going to begin with a few slides from my family. Okay, so let's see if this works. There we go. So the first one in this image, you can see, okay, wait, sorry about that. There. You can see my great-grandmother. And it's an image taken in the first decade of the 20th century. And if you look really carefully at the slide, if you look at her hairline, you will see that she is wearing a sheitel, the wig that an observant married Jewish woman would have worn. And if you look in this next image, you will see her daughter, my grandmother, and taken at the same time. She's not old-fashioned at all in this image. It's actually, she's a very she 14-year-old, and she's wearing that era's stylish linen dress. And in the next image, you will see my mother in a park on a warm spring day. And she's wearing what she told me she always wore back then, a white blouse and a black pencil skirt. And if you look over her shoulder, you can see that there's a baby's bonnet peeking out, and that's actually me. So what am I doing by starting a book, America's Jewish Women, by asking about clothing? But this was really important because as the clothing of the women in my family changed, I saw that what I wanted to know was what had changed across the generations for them. What was different about the way they raised their families? What was different about the kinds of work that they did? What about their politics? And most of all, in that book, I wanted to know how they braided being Jewish into their lives. So in May 2018, I finished writing this introduction. I pushed send on my computer, and I sent the final manuscript into production. 10 months later, the book appeared. But in those intervening months, and since its publication, I have, like so many here this evening, found myself thinking more than ever before about anti-Semitism. I won't join the parade of journalists, pundits, communal leaders, politicians, statisticians, and scholars arguing, measuring, and countering anti-Semitic canards and attacks from the left, right, and those in between. But because I am an historian, our current moment propels me to turn to the topic of anti-Semitism in the American past. You won't be surprised to know that I am not alone. The trajectory of American Jewish historiography on anti-Semitism tends to wax and wane. When historians sense little anti-Semitism in the air, we ignore the topic. At the turn to the new millennium, while anti-Semitism was rising in Europe, but apparently not in the United States, one scholar was so sanguine that he confidently titled his book, The Death of American Anti-Semitism. As we well know, American anti-Semitism was not dead. As a new crop of historians are now probing its history, we are wondering, can it inform our present? This David W. Belin lecture in American Jewish Affairs gives me the chance to think more deeply about the impact of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism on women's lives, and to raise new questions to ponder. So here are my questions. When, where, and how did America's Jewish women encounter this hatred, bigotry, and discrimination? How did they respond as individuals and collectives? Did anti-Semitism change the course of their lives? Finally, how will inserting women and gender as categories of analysis affect the future writing of the history of American anti-Semitism? So when I began looking for research on women and American anti-Semitism, I discovered that with a few exceptions, there is little to read. Interestingly, there is no article titled Anti-Semitism in the groundbreaking Jewish Women in America, an historical encyclopedia co-edited by the University of Michigan's own Deborah Dash Moore. She actually told me recently that she thought the articles on assimilation would cover the subject. But I'm not convinced that assimilation, the study of assimilation, can do that. I actually think that now, especially with this new plethora of anti-Semitism confronting us, that the time is ripe for us to explore questions related to women, gender, and American anti-Semitism. So in this evening's lecture, all I can do is make a start. Now, I want to say something first about the word anti-Semitism. Many of you will know that the term was coined in 1879. Historians like to argue, historians argue about the label. Some prefer anti-Judaism, others prefer Judeophobia. In the past, American Jews actually wrote about something that they called race prejudice. I'm not going to enter into that debate here. Anti-Semitism is the term the world uses today. I will use it for events after 1879 and rely for the most part on other vocabulary to discuss anti-Jewish animus before then. So let me go back to some of the research that I did in America's Jewish women. When I was researching the book, I found examples early in American history of Jewish women who wrote of their personal encounters with anti-Judaism. And the best known of these was Rebecca Gratz, the pioneering charity worker, educator, inveterate letter writer, who was so famous in her own day that a distant relative crowned her Queen of the Jews. Gratz's social welfare work brought her into close contact with Christians throughout her long life. She corresponded with Gertrude Gouverneur Ogden Meredith, a prominent Philadelphia hostess and writer. After Gratz mentioned prejudice against the Jews in a letter, Meredith reassured her that she had none. In fact, Meredith said, she would become angry when she heard good Christians speak about the wickedness of the Jews. To the contrary, she idealized the virtuous, law-abiding Jew who will be first in Abraham's bosom when the Messiah comes. Nevertheless, Meredith wished that the Jewish inferior classes would look up as if they were susceptible of religious impressions and pay attention to their religious duties. If they would do that, Meredith told Gratz, your temple would not then be unjustly denominated a den of thieves. In fact, Meredith wished for one little hour where she could teach in the synagogue, to lead the ignorant to reflect on the fallen state of his religion. Meredith's words presage the writings of the many evangelical societies that would soon emerge to, in their words, ameliorate the condition of the Jews, that is, convert them. Meredith did not preach conversion to Gratz, but her letter revealed the intricate ambivalence all too often underlying Christian philo-Semitism. Moreover, it was ultimately Christian chauvinism that prompted Gratz's most important Jewish communal endeavors and educational projects. So I'm going to jump from early American history, because that was actually in the first decade of the 19th century, and I'm going to jump to what happens in the United States in the decades after the Civil War. Gratz was still leading the many organizations she had helped found in the very first years after that war. But in the decades after this terrible event, the United States witnessed the emergence of a full-fledged anti-Semitic society. Historians find anti-Semitism surging in times of crisis and conflict. So just think about the aftermath of the Civil War. The United States had lost 750,000 men. It had seen hundreds and thousands maimed, wounded, widowed, and orphaned. And then a few years later, in 1873, there was such a disastrous economic crisis known as the Panic of 1873 that it used to be called, until the 1930s, the Great Depression. 2 Jewish women living as this anti-Semitic society was aborning sounded alarms. The first was Emma Lazarus. She's a well-known poet. You know that she wrote the poem in the base of the Statue of Liberty that has welcomed the huddled masses yearning to breathe free to America for more than a century. So I'm not going to talk about what she wrote. Instead, I'm going to focus on what Nina Morias wrote. Nina Morias, Cohen, after she was married, but when she was writing in 1881, she was known as Nina Morias, and she published Jewish Ostracism in America in the highbrow New York journal, the North American Review. Its readers already knew her as a champion of women's rights. Now she condemned anti-Jewish discrimination in her native land. Raised and educated in Philadelphia, where she won acclaim for her lecturing, teaching, and writing, Morias exposed how this country discriminated against her people. Although the first refugees from Russia's pogroms had already fled to America, Morias was not speaking about antipathy to impoverished foreigners. Instead, she drew attention to the host of social, institutional, and economic barriers that Jews just like her, well-educated, economically secure, upstanding citizens, confronted across their lives. They included, as she wrote, the hotel keeper who avoids the contact of the Hebrew purse. She was referring to the recent exclusions of prominent Jews from New York summer resorts. Morias argued that prejudices against the Jews, wrought in the very woof of Christianity, were tightly woven into the fabric of American life. The nation's schools, rife with this prejudice, wounded Jewish children from the moment they entered. Their teachings, whether a history of the printing press or a geography about India, became lessons in the proof of Christian progress. Everyday school children bowed their heads. They recited the Lord's Prayer. They listened to readings from the New Testament. Morias even quoted a teacher telling her best pupil placed at the end of the class, because in those days you sat where, according to your abilities, so the best pupil should have been in the front, but instead the best pupil was at the end. The teacher said, "I am sorry for you. It is your misfortune, not your fault, that you are a Jew." I have wondered if Morias was publishing painful words that she had heard as a child. Morias also talked about how American law discriminated against the Jews. Only 4 years had passed since New Hampshire, the last state with a religious test for public office, had amended its constitution. But other laws existed to coerce proper behavior on the Christian Sabbath. No work, no amusements, no drinking. These laws proved, contended Morias, that the musty odor of colonial charters and puritanical laws still clings to the halls of American legislation. Then, of course, no surprise, there were the many slurs about Jews' financial shrewdness and their unscrupulous ways of making money. These charges, she claimed, injured every Jew, making all into objectionable characters. If the merchant who cheats his creditors is a Jew, then Judaism is made responsible for fraud and theft. If he is a Christian, no one blames his faith. Jew, 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 she continued, is the one all-comprehensive charge. At the end of her essay, she asked her readers to learn the truth about her people. Loving peace, charitable to all, they were the best of citizens. Grant them, she pleaded, the liberty to contribute fully to the life of our new republic. In the early 1880s, Nina Morias and Emma Lazarus, two Jewish women born in this land of liberty and entwined within the full-fledged anti-Semitic society that had come into view, used that liberty to protest prejudice and discrimination against their people. Next, a new Jewish women's organization would emerge. Fighting anti-Semitism would become one of its aims. The National Council of Jewish Women was founded in 1893 during Chicago's World's Columbian Exposition. Many of you will know that it still exists today. Its founders never claimed that anti-Semitism spurred their organizing, yet standing up to anti-Semitism, arousing, as they said, general sentiment against religious persecution, wherever, whenever, and against whomever shown, and finding means to prevent such persecutions became one of Council's objectives. Council's social welfare work with the East European Jewish immigrants then flooding into America obliquely addressed anti-Judaism. With Jewish prostitutes and pimps providing fodder for anti-Semites, Council warned girls and women traveling on their own to America about the evil men and women out there offering paid work and even marriage to lure them to destruction. Then, in 1907, objecting to the lurid news accounts of the crime of the century, the murder trial of millionaire Harry Thaw, who had killed his wife's one-time lover and rapist, the architect Stanford White, Council established a committee for the purity of the press. So you can see one of its reports here. For Jewish women, cleaning up the press included banning negative depictions of Jews in the news and also on stage and screen. Council members around the country told their city's newspaper editors that unless their pages mentioned the religion of every suspected criminal, they should stop identifying the Jews. So here's an echo of what Nina Morias had been writing, but I don't think they knew what she had written. The women screened films and vaudeville acts and tried to convince theater managers to refrain from showing those unfairly portraying Jews. At the same time, in some chapters, they lobbied legislators to pass laws preventing discrimination in places of public accommodation and amusement. They even protested discrimination by business firms that refused to hire Jewish girls, as they called them. After the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, known as ADL, which still exists today, was founded in 1913, Council became the only women's organization joining in its work. Convinced that erasing damaging depictions of Jews in literature, fiction, and cartoons would go a long way toward eroding the nation's prejudice, the ADL appealed to the Council's many mothers it sent them to canvass local bookstores to see if they were selling copies of Mother Goose that included this offensive rhyme. And here there's different versions of it, but basically it went, Jack sold his egg to a rogue of a Jew who cheated him out of half of his due. The Jew got his goose, which he vowed he would kill, resolving at once his pockets to fill. In bookstores across the country, the women paged through Mother Goose. Then they contacted publishers asking them to excise the offending rhyme from their next editions. I've seen one report that said that it disappeared by the 1930s, but then I've also seen another report that showed that it was still in editions of Mother Goose into the 1960s. Because of this cooperation between the ADL and the National Council of Jewish Women, the council had a seat at the ADL's governing board's weekly meetings. And by 1920, when Jenny Franklin Pervin, who was dubbed the Jewish Jane Addams, referring to the pioneering social worker and Nobel laureate, took her place there, she was already a force in Chicago's civic and Jewish communal life. She'd actually helped clean up the beaches of the city. So in 1920, she went to council, gave her report, and this is the first meeting the National Council has had since the end of World War I. And her report presents a mound of evidence of anti-Semitism on the rise. And she actually told the members of council, she said to them, listening to reports week after week of offenses against the Jewish people is not a pleasant occupation. So now she told council what she had learned. Lecturers circulated canards about Russian Jews. They attempted to antagonize the American Legion against Jews. And she went on, but the most damaging of all were the articles about the international Jew, the world's foremost problem, appearing in the pages of Henry Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. Council heard from Pervin that 40,000 full-blooded women, the membership of council, interested in their Jewish heritage, had to go home and read that paper to comprehend that they lived in an hour when, as never before, the Jew is threatened with extinction. Council's executive secretary, Jenny Hertz, echoed Pervin's remarks. She told the well-heeled women of council, we, most of whom have never before been called upon to face anti-Semitism in person, must stand together like a wall to meet the attacks of lying enemies. The octopus of anti-Semitism is extending its ugly tentacles over this fair land. Decades later, when a council leader faced anti-Semitism up close and personal, she unknowingly took a page out of its historic playbook. In 1973, Ann Sheldon was president of her 400 women strong South Dade, Florida Council chapter. While shopping at the butcher counter of her local Grand Union grocery one day, she saw a man from the deli counter run over seething. He complained that he had just prepared 3 platters for a woman who didn't tip him. The butcher wisecracked. What was she, Jewish or something? Outraged, Sheldon threw her package of meat at the butcher, shouting, "You're not getting a tip from this Jewish woman either." Fighting tears, she ran to the store's manager to tell him that if that butcher was still working there the next day, she would bring 300 women to picket. The manager apologized, and she never saw the butcher again. Standing up against anti-Semitism, Ann Sheldon claimed her place in the long line of council activists. Other of America's Jewish women, like Ann Sheldon, who told me her story earlier this year, long remembered personal encounters with anti-Semitism. Some upended and redirected their lives. Historians have long studied the discrimination and quotas at the elite men's and women's colleges that spiraled out to hundreds of other schools. Oops, sorry, there we go. At the New Jersey College of Women, later renamed Douglas College, founding Dean Mabel Douglas began applying subjective criteria to admissions after she realized that the entrance certificate giving grades in class had not shut out the undesirables. Between 1928 and 1932, while the number of Jews in northern New Jersey increased, and the number of men at Rutgers University, the women's college male counterpart, more than doubled, a matter trustees would soon remedy, the female Jewish student body declined by more than a third, from 17% to 11%. In 1930, the college accepted 61% of its Christian applicants. It accepted 31% of its Jewish applicants, even though the admissions committee had conceded that the scholastic standing of the Jewesses is usually better than that of the other students. Accusations that Dean Douglas discriminated against matriculated Jewish students also surfaced. One complaint alleged that the dean had told an applicant for the school's education degree, "I will be brutally frank with you. You are rejected because you are Jewish." Prejudicial attitudes from faculty and administrators would long persist. In the mid-1960s, when Ingrid Alpern, who was educated in Houston and Dallas public schools, was applying to college, her Radcliffe interview opened with, "Where do you go to church, dear?" 50 years after graduating from Smith College, Alpern told her sister alumni how one evening her housemates turned to her and said, "It's not because you're Jewish that we don't like you." Educational discrimination quashed opportunities. In an era when fewer women went to college, and even if they did, if they worked outside the home, most had to learn typing and shorthand to get a job. Schools, like the famed Catherine Gibbs School for Secretarial and Executive Training for Educated Women, could write Jewish applicants. "We are sorry to inform you that it is our policy not to accept students of Jewish nationality." So back in 1920, the executive secretary of the National Council of Jewish Women could presume that most of its well-to-do members had never experienced anti-Semitism. My question is, could she say the same thing by World War II? The war years are considered the high tide of American anti-Semitism. In November 1942, the magazine She published, and you can see the cover here that shows it, "I Am a Jewess." Its anonymous author bared, so the magazine advertised, the secret dread in her heart that the land of the free is drifting dangerously near to the rocks of racial hatred. I don't know who Anonymous was, but her article chronicled almost every anti-Semitic trope sprouted in those years. She called them the weeds that would destroy the roots of American democracy. Her evidence, much of it drawn from the experiences of her children and close relatives, unsurprisingly revealed discrimination in summer resorts, college admissions, and career opportunities. But she then asked, what should her children do? Should they embrace another religion? Should they lie, living in fear of being found out? Should they change their names? Her hopes for an end to prejudice as Americans united behind the war effort were smashed. She had seen how even in volunteer war work, anti-Semitism reared its ugly head. Looking overseas, she concluded, it can happen here too. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and I'm going to try and give some analysis to what these examples I think are saying to us. First of all, let me say there's so much more to say about anti-Semitism and gender, especially about confrontations and responses of Jewish women on the political left and those who met it up close and personal in the feminist movement. And I don't mean just in recent years, but from the early days of second wave feminism. Those topics need their own sustained analysis and are beyond the scope of this lecture. So let me return to my questions. Where, when, and how did America's Jewish women encounter anti-Semitism? How did they respond? Did gender inflect their responses? As we have seen, America's Jewish women experienced a range of encounters subsumed under the broad amorphous term that refers to this historic oppression. In classrooms and on campus, they faced religious hatred and racial prejudice. Applying to college and for jobs, they confronted legally sanctioned discriminations that redirected their lives. Vigilantly, they looked out for anti-Jewish bias, even in nursery rhymes. They addressed correspondents and friends who voiced this age-old prejudice. They warned what would happen if America went the way of Europe. Jewish women responded to anti-Semitism with their pens. I find it striking that in the 1880s, when Nina Morias and Emma Lazarus were writing, that these women who had no claims to communal authority published important articles on anti-Semitism in leading American magazines. No Jewish men, and I know because I've looked for this, no Jewish men were then writing about this topic in those forums. As women and as Jews, Lazarus and Morias represented double outsiders to those audiences. I wonder if the magazine's editors considered criticism of Christian America coming from females less objectionable, or would feminine displays of bruised feelings, indignation, and injury at prejudice and discrimination be deemed more acceptable? In thinking about women's gendered responses to anti-Semitism, what also stands out is how often Jewish women encountered this prejudice up close and personal, meeting it through their children, extended family, friends, neighbors, and shopkeepers. The trope of mothers' painful encounters with anti-Semitism through their children, similar to that conveyed by Anonymous, keeps coming through the literature. I want to give you just one more example. More than a century ago, one Jewish mother told the Washington Post about the insults, innuendos, and slander directed at her son's faith during his recent trial. Its purpose, she wrote, was to poison and destroy. The letter writer was Mrs. Ray Frank. 2 years later, her son, Leo Frank, the Atlanta pencil factory manager wrongfully convicted of murder, would be lynched by a mob. There is yet another promising lens for understanding women, gender, and anti-Semitism. The prism of the history of emotions offers new perspectives for analysis. Modern Jewish historians, by and large, have not embraced the emotional turn in historical writing that is now 3 decades old. But historians of emotions teach us that intense feelings flare in moments of trouble, whether during a personal encounter or as society undergoes some strain. These scholars understand the importance of emotions conveyed by memories of collective victimization and how these are constructed and reconstructed. The women whose up-close and personal encounters with anti-Semitism I've recounted this evening recorded emotional responses. Nina Morias displayed injury. Leaders of the National Council of Jewish Women were afraid of the octopus of anti-Semitism. Anonymous's cousin said her neighbor's refusal to let her join them in volunteer work for the war broke her heart. Much more remains to be done to analyze these phenomena. But in closing, I hope that in this David W. Belin lecture in American Jewish Affairs, I have convinced you that gender must become one of the prisms for writing the future history of American anti-Semitism. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Pam. That was really enlightening talk. Really appreciated hearing it. And we have a bit of time for questions. So I think the way we can do questions actually is people can ask a question in the Q&A, or alternatively, you can raise your hand by clicking on the little raise hand thing, and then I can allow you to talk. I can allow people to talk from that who are here on Zoom. And then a few people submitted questions in advance. So I think I see one hand that is up, that's been up for a little bit. So maybe I'll start with a question from the audience and see if I can allow Rachel Cranston to talk since her hand is up. So I'm going to click on the allow her to talk and see what happens. Is this working? I don't think it is working. All right,
maybe she would have to unmute, but I don't know if she can.
Yeah. Okay. All right, well, let me see. Well, she actually submitted a question in advance as well. So maybe I will go to that question that she submitted in advance, which I see is, in what ways, if any, do you think recent events challenge once accepted paradigms in how American Jewish historians have conceptualized anti-Semitism?
So I mean, first of all, hi, Rachel. Secondly, I think the recent events have really challenged our thinking about anti-Semitism in American history. One of the things that jumped out at me is, and I don't know if you've been part of this, but there's been a working group at the American Jewish Historical Society on anti-Semitism. And thanks to Zoom, you know, we could all participate. We didn't have to travel to New York for it. And at the very first meeting last October, we were asked if recent events had made us rethink any of our own scholarship. And my immediate response was that I would have paid more attention to anti-Semitism in my book, America's Jewish Women. Now, when I went back to the book, I actually discovered that it's there much more often than I thought, that it kept anti-Judaism, anti-Semitic encounters kept creeping in. But I didn't see it as a kind of sustained thread. So it's really made me rethink what I'm doing. And as Jeffrey said at the beginning of the remarks, I mean, this is a brand new project for me. And it's really stunning to me how no one has really paid attention to the question of gender, especially related to women in terms of anti-Semitism. In fact, as you and I both know, the Encyclopedia Jewish Women in America is being redone. It's about to be relaunched. And I went to the managing editor and I said, who's writing the article on anti-Semitism? And she said, there isn't one. So even in the new edition, it's not going to appear as a separate subject. So I think it's certainly causing us to rethink accepted paradigms.
So maybe I'll ask you about the gender issue as well. And specifically, I wonder if you can talk about any stereotypes of Jewish women that come out, because a lot of what you talked about in the talk have to do with stereotypes of Jewish men, of criminality, and you talked about women's experiences of anti-Semitism, largely experiences of exclusion. I think you said exclusion from summer resorts, from universities, and from career paths. But what about stereotypes that were perpetuated specifically about Jewish women?
So the first answer is that is the one place where there's been substantial work. Rivell and Prell, of course, has done tremendous, wonderful work on the construction of the stereotypes around Jewish women and the changing stereotypes from the ghetto girl to the Jewish American princess, the Jewish mother. And I decided, at least for now, that I'm not working on that, in part because, as Prell showed, this is really about internal battles within the American Jewish community, gender politics within the American Jewish community that then has spilled outward. It's been broadcast beyond the community. And my questions are about experience, because as a social historian, I'm interested in the issue of experience rather than in this particular issue of representations. But we definitely have really good work that's been done on that. So it's a way of also, making a departure from what's already been studied. But if I go into those cultural representations, that's an entire book in and of itself. And even when I wrote America's Jewish Women, I actually deliberately did not talk about culture. because there was no way to make a book of reasonable length and then talk about Jewish women and cultural contributions. I mean, it's just an enormous, enormous subject.
Okay, and then before I go to some of the other questions that have been accumulating, maybe I'll ask you another one that I'm thinking about, which is the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism. And if you, well, I don't know, maybe I'll just, rather than pose as a question, just put that out there and see if you can say something on that.
Right. So, so my former colleague was Ibram Kendi, who wrote the definitive work, stamped from the beginning, the definitive history of racism in America, and then has also written the book that's currently on the bestseller list, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And when I read Stamped from the Beginning, which is really an intellectual history of various efforts to deal with the questions of racism that then are actually in and of themselves so often racist, I kept wondering, about the connection between Jews and racism. He doesn't talk about it in the book, but I think, and maybe I'm unique in this, but I think that anti-Semitism is a form of racism. It is a particular kind of racism. And but I'm also very well aware that at the moment, much of the anti-racist discourse doesn't want to include anti-Semitism in that discourse. Mm-hmm. You finding the same thing?
That seems to make sense to me. Yeah. Yeah. Let me go to some of the questions here that have accumulated. So starting with Carla Goldman, who writes, "Great lecture." I agree with that. Could Pam comment on Laura Hobson's gentleman's agreement?
Okay. Hi, Carla. So first of all, it's so great. Like all these wonderful colleagues are here. Hobson's gentleman's agreement. First of all, I'm not the expert on that. But Hobson's gentleman's agreement is a very, very important film that I need to think more about the representations in there of Jewish women and anti-Semitism. So there's a very famous scene where the secretary confesses that she has changed her name and that she couldn't get a job when she was Jewish. What I remember about Hobson is that a lot of what she puts into that book, it was published in 1947, made into a film in 1947. A lot of what she puts into that book were experiences that she had had. So I need to look more closely at Laura Z, which is her memoir, and see where that surfaces. But she's not, if I can deviate for a second, she's not the only prominent writer of those years talking about anti-Semitic encounters. There's Edna Ferber describes a powerful encounter that actually happened in Michigan, where she was invited to a soiree at some industrialist kind of, summer home, and she's at the soiree. It's the early 30s, and the industrialist, it's not Henry Ford, but the industrialist starts talking about money-grubbing Jews, and she watches how everybody around the table latches onto the theme, and she turns to the assembled dinner guests and says, "I am a Jew." And she says she'd never seen such hatred on the people who are around her. And so that's, again, that related to my point about it's up close and personal. I'm not saying Jewish men didn't experience anti-Semitism up close and personal as well. But it's those memories that seem to be so powerful, which is why I want to use history of emotions to kind of get at understanding this.
Okay. Next question, I'll go to Evan Frank, who asks, how about the 20th century? Did Adler's revolution of the women of the synagogue alter their unique position as advocates against anti-Semitism in America?
Obviously, women's roles in the synagogue have changed dramatically over the course of the 20th century. And I would actually say almost from the beginning, when you get these national women's organizations like the National Sisterhood organizations, all the way up to where we get to the end of the 20th century, and women are getting ordained in the liberal denominations of American Judaism. Has it changed their relationship to anti-Semitism? I actually see them as two different spheres. So women's roles in the synagogue are, kind of one bucket, and women wouldn't be encountering it, hopefully wouldn't be encountering anti-Semitism in the synagogue. They encounter it outside of the synagogue.
Okay, Anita Norwich asks, stereotypes about so-called self-hating Jews usually refer to men's internalization of anti-Semitic stereotypes. To what extent and in what ways do you think that the rhetoric and reality of anti-Semitism has been internalized by Jewish women?
So, hi, Anita. Great question. Um, I think I I think the not necessarily the rhetoric has been internalized, but it is the powerful sense that at any point in one's life they could encounter anti-Semitism. So it's not so much about. I know what you're getting at in terms of the rhetoric about and about Jewish men and the trying to escape the identification as Jews. But what I'm seeing is, and this is what's really been jumping out at me, is 50 years after some kind of encounter happened, these women are writing or telling these stories that anti-Semitic encounter marked them somehow in their lives. Did it mean that they internalized anti-Semitism? I don't think it's necessarily that. I think that it's anti-Semitism remains a powerful way in which Jews are marked out as Jews in American life.
Okay, and Deborah Dash Moore asks, to what extent has the experience of Jewish women with anti-Semitism fueled their criticism of American society to be transformed along gendered equality?
So first of all, hi and thanks. Thanks for that question. I think, okay. So let's think for a second about second wave feminism of the 1960s. So Betty Friedan has actually written that when she experienced exclusion, which she always attributed to the fact that she was a Jew, when she didn't get elected to join a sorority when she was in high school. And she's attributed the fact of that exclusion to eventually sensitizing her to how women were othered and therefore needed to advance their position in American life and to carry out the feminist revolution. That's not true for all feminists by any means, but I do think that it was true often enough so that encounters with anti-Semitism, seeing anti-Semitism. I mean, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg also talked about the fact that, she traveled and she saw signs saying no Jews allowed. And so was that the spark that led her to her feminism? I'm not going to make the direct connection, but there is that sensitivity of understanding what it means to be an outsider.
Okay, thanks. And I've got a few questions from Harvey Pillersdorf, but let me really ask one of them that I think is the one that you have most not yet answered, which is whether you think that anti-Semitism rises and falls with economic times, with better economic times, where when things are going good, anti-Semitism disappears or dissipates, and when things are going poorly, it's more prevalent.
Most historians think that anti-Semitism, that it rises and falls based on external circumstances. I think it never goes away. I think that it remains underneath it, but there are moments where it comes out for all sorts of different reasons: economic reasons, political reasons, social reasons, and we're in one of those moments at right now. But it's also it doesn't always have to rise if there's an economic crisis, but it often will rise during an economic crisis. And that's why I mentioned the Panic of 1873, that moment when that anti-Semitic society comes into full view in the latter decades of the 19th century, part of it is related to that panic.
Okay. And Steve Dworkin asked, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but if you know of any work with regard to Canada, my home country.
Okay. I'm sorry, I don't. I really don't. I haven't looked at Canada. I imagine there would be a lot of similarities, but I haven't done the research to be able to say that.
It's a different world over there in Canada.
Yeah.
Let me ask another question, probably the last question, unless another one pops up here as I'm asking, which is the early writers that you spoke of from the 1880s, Emma Lazarus and Nina Morias. Both of them were born in the United States. And it's a time when there is a great wave of immigration coming in. I'm just wondering if the immigrants are also writing about anti-Semitism in America, or if immigrants who are coming from places where anti-Jewish sentiment is more prevalent then solely see America as Mary Anton's promised land.
Right. So that's a great question. If they were, so I looked at 4 or 5 leading magazines, American magazines in the 1880s, and I was looking to see if Jewish men were writing in them. And I'm not finding Jewish men. At that point, we're not going to have immigrants writing in English language American magazines at that point. If they're observing it, it's going to be within the discourse. They would have been writing in Yiddish, and it would have been internal. It would have been for the group. What struck me about Lazarus and Morias is that they have some kind of authority to be speaking outside of the community. And then as I said, I went looking for articles. I figured, there are a lot of rabbis by the 1880s, and there are enough of them, and they're not talking about it. They're not writing about anti-Semitism. Are they worried that they'll rock the boat? Are they worried that this isn't what they want to address? Why is it that women are, in that particular moment, the voice that's actually bringing the anti-Semitic society into view?
I know other questions have come up, but there was one question that I had written down while you were speaking, but then in your conclusions, you said you're deliberately not going to talk about it. But nevertheless, I thought I'd just kind of give you an opportunity to do so a bit, which is the relationship between feminism and anti-Semitism, and whether you think that this, second generation feminists were influenced by or were affected by anti-Semitism and the degree to which they thought about it. Maybe just if you can comment as a final remark, a few words on that, since I know a lot of people are probably wondering.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I couldn't work it into this paper because I think it really needs to be a chapter of a book. But we know, especially the feminists who were involved with early gay rights movements, lesbian movements. I have a stack of articles that they were writing about anti-Semitism in the women's movement from the 70s into the 80s, which is why I said deliberately that those who are involved in the politics of the left, it was something that I couldn't do here. But I also said it's not just since 2016. It's not that anti-Semitism within the women's movement takes a number of different kinds of expressions. One is denigration of any kind of Jewish difference, but another one is also has a anti-Judaism component to it, which is that it elevates goddess worship and accuses Jews of having murdered, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of having murdered the goddess. So that's another component of it. And there's another component of it which actually talks about Jesus being the first feminist in response to the rabbis. So that's why I didn't do it in this talk. It was too complicated to try and weave it in.
Well, next time, or maybe it'll be in the book, if a book comes out of this. But in any case, let me thank you on behalf of all of us and on behalf of the Frankel Center. Thank you for this enlightening talk, and we will look forward to the published version, which will be out probably within the year on the Frankel Center website and the University of Michigan Press website. And again, thank you, Pam, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Good night.